Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're talking about Succession Season 3, Episode 6, Whatever It Takes. And quite frankly, I don't see how Logan can go down if he's picking the next president. So at this point, Ken needs a miracle. He needs a hero. I don't see how he can get out of this, and this episode, I think, foreshadowed the end, which is Ken's demise. So we will start with Ken. The episode begins and Ken is flustered. Things are not going well. They're kind of doing a practice round for when they kind of present themselves to the government. And Ken is doing this very strange thing where he's trying to pin everything on his father and act like he knew nothing. Like his hands are clean and he undermines his own sort of participation in all this. And the issue he has is that they're kind of falling behind. Everything is going according to his father's pace. And, he wants so desperately to reposition the context and change the narrative, right? So his father managed to get the president kicked out. They're spending the weekend picking the next president. And Ken is over here surviving. And this tension between Ken and Lisa eventually explodes and they're no longer together, right? And I think Lisa took the case because she thought it was a guarantee. And so she's trying to explain to Ken, listen, Waystar did a very good job of covering their tracks. It's not that easy. It seems like ever since this investigation started, they've opened safety protocols, they've been cooperating, they've been kind of putting their best foot forward. So this hasn't really helped in terms of momentum. And I think this narrative of Ken's did such a good job of persuading Lisa to come on that by the time she saw the papers, she she basically told him yeah, these papers lack the explosiveness that we were told that it was suggested that they have, right? And she pretty much tells him you kind of let us on. And the only kind of hope for Ken is that his narrative was good enough. And he's so focused on building a team that looks good, right? He has the right lawyer, he has the right social media team. And it's doing enough to kind of have people perceive him as a threat. But behind the scenes, it seems like he's talking a big game, right? And at one point he has the audacity to say to Lisa, listen, love what you do, but you need to do more. And she's just kind of done with him, right? She's looking at him like, you squirmy little. So they get to this big sort of interview and it's a disaster, right? Ken and Lisa walk out of there. Lisa felt undermined. She felt like Ken basically, again, you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? It's the whole point of giving you immunity is that you need immunity, Ken. If you have immunity, you did something wrong. You know what I mean? Lisa's logic is listen, you need to change your behavior. And Ken, at that moment, he starts, waving political, he starts saying they're all afraid of my father. He's putting on a big show. And this kind of embarrasses Lisa. And Ken tries desperately to get Lisa on board to be listen, I get these papers don't have anything, but we need to do more on the public front to kind of make it look like these papers are threatening, because straight up, you're correct. And I think the moment Ken and Lisa were done is when Lisa looked at him and said, do you think you're smarter than me? And Ken wanted to say yes, right? And he was just no. And after that, they were done, right? He had the audacity to fire her. And I don't think he liked feeling undermined, right? He likes to be the one in charge. And he felt like he was being babysat a bit. And so he fires her by saying that she's being toxic, which, coming from the most toxic individual, I thought was Rich. He does this while casually planning his 40th birthday party, which I thought was also super trippy. So at this point, they have no choice but to change the context, which is a long shot, right? So the only realistic thing he can do is try and flip someone. So throughout the episode, they keep making calls. And I didn't know who they kept making calls to, right? Desperately. And at one point, Ken said, this is our primary. We need him. And so the person they were trying to call is Tom. So Tom, at this point, they've dubbed him the Christmas tree. And I Urban Dictionary'd Christmas tree, and there were several meanings, and all of them were quite horrifying. So Tom, at this point, has been ignoring calls. He's in this mental state where he stopped kind of even pretending to think about, not trying to think about it. He thinks about prison all day, every day. He has a prison consultant. He's doing prison training, slowly getting his palate used to the food and the sort of experiences that he can expect. So he's trying to get himself mentally ready, and it really doesn't help that no one in the family cares. So at this point, it's assumed that Tom is going to prison, And I loved, or not loved, but Shiv's insensitivity to him. Like, nobody cares that he's going to prison. They're like, okay, we get it, you're going away. And the way Shiv kind of talks to him, like, he's kind of shook, right? And it reminds me of when Ken was about to go to prison. Like, nobody really cared. They're like, it is what it is, and it has nothing to do with me. And that's the whole problem with this family, is that unless it affects them directly, they don't really care. But when it affects them, the whole world stops, right? Like, everybody has to be on call. And so Tom is just exhausted. He can't, his only motivation to even have, you know, any type of intimacy with his wife is to try and get a baby. And at some point, like, I think one of the best lines in this was, you know, he just didn't feel like it. What would be the point? It would be like spreading cake batter all over a brick wall or something nasty like that. So he's thinking logically, right? Like, everything about him is like in survival mode. And he's kind of, there's no hope, right? Like, he's kind of trained his brain to the point where he accepts even taking on Greg's crimes. So Greg kind of, you know, goes out on a limb and says, hey, Tom, are you willing to take on my crimes? Like, since it's not going to make a difference to you. And to be honest, Greg would not survive prison, right? In his words, he would be a target for misadventure. Like, he would not survive very long. And he's too anxious, right? And the thing with Greg is, at first I thought maybe this being cut off would trigger kind of suicidal tendencies, but I think Greg is a bit too slimy. Like, I think he finds a way out, and he did. And this conversation was the definition of, like, it never hurts to ask, right? He was just like, listen, I have nothing to lose. Let me just ask this guy. And on the flip side, it never really hurts to hear somebody out. So after all these missed calls, Tom finally agrees to talk to Ken, and we get to this meeting. And this was the shadiest meeting I've ever seen. Again, Tom is out of it. He starts ordering food. Ken is looking at him. And the way Ken is dressed, I would not be surprised if he was wearing a wire of some kind. He's wearing a hat. Like, the whole thing was just so sus. And Tom kind of picks up on that, right? He shows up to the meeting. He's in a suit. And I noticed that Tom didn't change his clothes, right? Like, he's there and he doesn't really care. He's like, I'm going to hear you out, but I already have my answer. And so throughout the conversation, Tom is very careful not to incriminate himself. He doesn't say anything that could damage him in any way, right? Like, they both have notes on each other. Nothing is certain. All these things. And Tom's motivation is love, right? He really loves his wife. And I think even though she doesn't love him as much as he loves her, he would do anything for her and this family. And I think Ken almost convinced him. But the part where he totally lost him is when he started questioning his manhood. Because at one point, Ken says, like, you know what I mean? She'll support her man. Or he made some sort of sly comment. And Tom was triggered. And he kind of asks, like, how does it benefit me to turn my back on my wife and her family? Like, how does that make me a man? Like, excuse me, sir? And then he goes in, like, Tom is super triggered. And what he said, I haven't even thought about. And it may foreshadow the rest of this season. Because at one point he says, I've seen you get screwed many times, but I've never seen your father get screwed, not even once. And he's like, I have a hunch, you know? So Tom, like, when he said that, I had to think about it, because it is true. Logan's never, like, nothing's ever happened to him. But there are a few times where we've seen him kind of unravel, but normally he gets back into it. Whereas Ken goes from 0 to 100. Like, there's no chill with him. Like, he kind of either breaks down all the way or not at all. And Tom was like, listen, I don't think you have the mental strength to survive this. And he walks away. And then Ken has the audacity to take pictures. And I don't know what these pictures say, right? Because, again, Tom is not really dressed in a way to suggest that he's hiding. I don't think he cares. He kind of laughed because I think, you know, he's very observant. And so he knows what kind of person Ken is. So he kind of laughs and leaves, right? And so at this point, Ken is out of options. He can't flip Tom. That was the end of that conversation. So he needs a miracle. And it's not looking good for him at all. So now we'll turn to Logan and the power of the 1%. So Logan, Shiv, and Roman are on their way to something called the Future Freedom Summit. And it's essentially this weird summit where politicians prostitute themselves for money. And the goal is to pick the next president, I guess. And so they're on this plane, and we automatically can understand where Logan got his UTI from. And he seems to have a girlfriend, and they kept making eyes at each other throughout this episode, and it was really creeping me out. Like, I get that he, you know, like the man has needs, but just because we've only seen one side of Logan, it just kind of trips me out. So it seems like all the work that ATN has been doing to kind of change the narrative has been working, right? And they're kind of having this conversation about how these rumors get started. And one of the rumors is that the Attorney General has dartboards, like has Logan's face on a dartboard. And again, they've kind of created this narrative where they're the victims and they're just trying to expose the truth, right? And in a world where Logan is the victim, I mean, that takes some talent in terms of their media department. And these people are far from victims, as we find out in this sort of forum. And so they get off the plane and Shiv kind of asks to have a moment with her father. And in this car, Shiv starts making plans. So Shiv is the politics expert. This is her background and this was her passion before her father manipulated her to join the company. And so she gets in the car and she starts making decisions right away, right? She's like, the VP he's not gonna win. And she's kind of going through her list of candidates, right? Like she's done her research and she really wants to show her dad that he can kind of rely on her for this. And at one point she says, you know what, Roman should not be allowed to speak, you know, like basically we need to put him on the back burner. And I thought that was funny because it was Roman that in the end wins the hardest, right? Because his father is most happy with Roman at the end because he takes charge in a way that, you know, we'll talk about later. But Shiv is really aggressive and she keeps thanking herself, right? She's like, thanks to me, we still have a company. And Logan was like, you want a medal? Like, excuse me, ma'am? And he doesn't thank her. He doesn't acknowledge it. He's just like, yeah, like, I'm not gonna, like, he just doesn't care whatsoever. Okay, so we get to this 1% meeting and it's kind of a trip, right? So they're all private attendees. They're not supposed to say that they ever attended. And they're all trying to protect their portfolios. And Logan's goal is to pick someone that will never turn on him again. So he miscalculated the last time and he never imagined that the president would go against him. And now he's just kind of like done. He wants to pick someone who's best for him and only him. And so the candidates are as follows. First is the VP. Second is this guy who basically pitches himself by saying he'll throw Logan in jail. So his strategy is to talk to the kids in hopes of convincing the dad, who he then will promise to kick out. And then there's the neo-Nazi, and then there's Connor. So initially it looked very promising for Connor. You know what I mean? Like he's really kind of making a show of himself. He's very passionate about becoming the president, and I think he likes the idea of it, but he doesn't actually know what it means at all. And he's willing to do whatever it takes, right? He's willing to pimp out his girlfriend for political science. And the jokes they were making around her, like she was just a piece of meat, right? Like he just was so indifferent to her existence, and it really speaks to the kind of people that are in this room. So this is just one big clown show, Connor being the biggest clown, and they're all just trying to posture for attention, right? And there's some desperation. So the VP initially was the obvious choice, but I think he took himself out of the running for many reasons, right? So there's this awkward conversation. So the thing with him is that they keep making these comments and there is a lot of clever writing, right? So he's the obvious choice, but he has all these weird mannerisms, like he licks his lips, and they kept commenting on that, and like the timing of it was very funny. And at one point he kind of comes up to him and he says, hey, I'm with you on tech. I'm with you on this and that. And Logan was looking at him like, I don't really care about that. Are you going to fire the Attorney General and have my back? Like that's what he's thinking, right? And the vibe I got from this VP was like, he's not willing to do anything for this man, right? He's willing to accommodate him in terms of like keep him rich. But if it kind of came down to it, he was like, the vibe was, it was kind of desperate in that he understood he needed his support, but he didn't really care about it too much. And just as him and Logan are talking, I think when the conversation was over, he licked his lips again, and I was just cringing. I'm like, what even is this? And so everybody's kind of concerned with how they're going to come off. And so the candidate that ends up winning is this guy called McKinnon. And there's a conversation like between him and Roman's true colors really showed, right? Like the thing with Roman is that I was starting to warm up to him, and then he reminds us that he's a piece of shit. And I think with Roman, like he's been so spoiled and he's been in this sort of bubble for so long that he doesn't really see anything outside of himself, right? He's kind of thinking like his father. He's thinking, what's best for me? And that's it. He's not really thinking of the consequences, and you know, he's very insensitive to the type of guy that he just picked. There's a conversation between McKinnon and Shiv, and I feel like everything makes sense in context, because it wasn't until this moment that I realized why Shiv will never be given power, right? Because in a room full of white men, she has no say, right? So at some point, they kind of get into a conversation, and Shiv does not like this man, right? She calls him red pill. He burns religious books. He's basically as right as they come. And he's basically just, he's the worst of them. And this guy is so condescending, right? Like at one point he was like, do you read Plato, right? Like he's talking down to her because all he sees is a woman. And that was the vibe I was getting. The thing that this man did very successfully is that first he called Logan irrelevant. Like he kind of gave off this vibe where he didn't care. You know what I mean? Like he wasn't gonna bend over for anyone. And I think Logan was impressed by that, because it's better to deal with someone who's at least transparent than someone who's, you know, will smile in your face and then stab you in the back later, which is what happened to Logan with this president. So we get to this family meeting, and this family meeting was, man, the power of, like, white power indeed. Like, they basically are sitting there having this conversation about who they want to push as president. The first person they consider is Connor. And I had so much respect for Greg, because at one point he says, I owe it to my country, but please anyone but Connor. Because Connor is not realistic. And actually, in that room, side by side, it was ridiculous. Like, there's just no way that you can't even almost push Connor, right? He's a blank slate. He has no experience. He's dumb as a rock. Connor is the type of guy that sounds really smart, but there's no substance behind anything that he's saying. Like, everything is kind of theoretical for him. Like, it's just kind of like, I'll try this, but there's no, like, any substance behind it. In this episode, Shiv was showing some sense. And I thought it was interesting that Shiv's candidate was the only one that got no time with Logan. Like, they didn't even almost consider whatever Shiv was saying. And she was pushing hard. She was making a lot of logical claims, because she kind of understood where the conversation was going, which is, you know, this McKinnon guy. So Roman pitches this guy. And the way he pitches him is really interesting, because Roman, again, he says something interesting. He kind of tells Shiv, like, listen, you have fur coats and, like, you'll be fine. And again, there's that condescension, right? Where Roman is basically implying, Shiv, you don't know what's good for you. You're kind of talking like all woke, but let me and your dad handle it, because you don't know what you're saying, and you're being hysterical, and you're letting the estrogen kind of get to your head. So there is, again, when you watch Shiv with all these other men, it just doesn't seem possible for her to have a say, right? And so the way that Roman kept coming back at her by kind of pointing out her wealth was a way of kind of suggesting, like, listen, you were doing what's best for you, even if you're too dumb to see it. So in the end, it comes down to two candidates. And again, the candidate that Logan picks is the one that he thinks will win and give him what he wants. Because at the end of the day, you have to win. So if you don't win, you lose your influence, period. But if you do help somebody win, there's still a chance, right? So they have a conversation with the VP first. And again, the VP's vibe, like, at one point he calls him and asks if he has a Coke and to fire the attorney general or something. And the vibe of this guy was like, excuse me, sir. Like, he's not even pretending to entertain the thought, right? Like, there's nothing about him. And it also doesn't help that he licks his lips and he's just not a dude that can win. So they have a conversation with him, and that's kind of a bust. And finally, Roman's candidate. So Roman and his candidate, there's this conversation they have in the bathroom. And I don't know, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but I was getting some tension there. Like, I don't know what was going on between the two of them. But we come to find out a lot about this man. He's very conservative. He kind of repeats his sort of political ideology. Like, he keeps talking about the composition of America and how, like, people trust people who look like them. And how, I think he said he lost his farm, and the people he described were in very, you know, very, very hateful kind of terms. Like, so he has an idea. He's basically, you know, as he's so far to the right, and he has a very specific idea of what America should look like. And at one point they kind of referenced like the big H, which I think was supposed to be like Hitler, right? And just the idea that this man takes political advice from the worst of them, like what kind of influences his policies or his state of mind. And Shiv kind of already said, right, like this guy is unstable, he is very ignorant. If he's in a position of power, he's going to be very dangerous. And after watching this sort of bathroom conversation, I think that's true. And I thought this was good casting, by the way. Like the acting by everyone was fantastic. The addition of this candidate, I felt kind of livened up the show a bit, because he has that vibe, right? Like he's playing him really well. Like you do get the sense that this guy's a ticking time bomb. And Roman just totally bypassed all of it, right? And I was so disgusted with him. And then I remembered what kind of person he was. And so in the end, he grabs a Coke, gives it to Logan, and that pretty much seals his fate. And so Logan decides to back him. And the way he kind of justifies his choice is by saying, like, I guess I'm just a climate denier. Basically trying to rebuke everything that Shiv is saying, right? So Shiv is saying, basically, this is not going to work. A man with this type of thinking, it's just never going to happen. And Logan said, well, listen, they thought I was never going to happen, and people thought I was going to go to jail, but here I am. And that's true, right? Like, it is true. You can never underestimate people, and you don't know what could happen. And so we get to the final scene, and they're kind of doing this photo op. And this photo op, again, reveals why Shiv will never have power, and the power that Logan has over everyone. So she refuses to take a picture with this man. And I think had Shiv said no, and stuck to her no, that would have said a lot about her, right? Like I would have had more respect for her. But in the end, she's gonna, like by kind of agreeing to be in the picture, what I got out of that is that maybe some part of her knows that this candidate is best for their family and kind of helping them get out of the situation that they're in. Like whether or not she was consciously aware of it, I'm not really sure. But again, like all the kind of respect she had built up, she totally like lost it when she agreed to be in that picture with that man. And again, it just goes to show, like ultimately you're going to do what's best for you, and they're all on the same page. It doesn't really matter what they're saying. It doesn't really matter how woke they seem. They're all just in it for themselves. And then that final scene where Logan and this guy are just kind of looking at her walk away, you know, it's just, it kind of seals the deal. So I appreciated this episode. It was excellent. And yeah, you guys let me know what you think, and until next time.